I'll speak at that volume.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, everybody. All right, we're here. Welcome to Hill Center. I'm Diana Ingram. I'm the executive director here, and I'm always very curious. Who has never been in the building before? Could you raise your... Welcome! Oh, golly, that's fabulous. Please come back. Please check out all the fabulous things that are happening at Hill Center. This is indeed an amazing evening to be we're in the very first naval hospital. This building was commissioned by Abraham Lincoln just after the Civil War and has now come back to life as an arts and cultural center. So how incredible to welcome these two cozy mystery writers from far away here at Hill Center. Take a moment, please, to turn off your mobile devices. And the fabulous thing about having such talent in the room is that there are many books associated with both Sujata Massey and Sir Sandy. Wait, it's a much more formal title, Sir Alexander Alistair McCall Smith. Anyway, East City Books, our neighbors up the road, have been absolutely fabulous and brought lots of books, both the most recent publications of these two authors, but also some favorites. And both of these folks will be signing books following their conversation. So when we finish, make haste right across the hall to East City Books, and then follow up with any questions then. So, without further ado, let me welcome Sujata Massey, our moderator this evening, who is herself an internationally acclaimed author. I'm really looking forward to reading your latest book, so thank you for being here, and thank you to you, Mr. Smith. All right.
Wow, what a wonderful crowd we've got here tonight. Let's see. Better? There we go. Okay. Thank you for finding your way here. You know, I only came from Baltimore, but it took about more than 2 hours. And you came from, tell us where you came from today.
Omaha, Nebraska. Am I transmitting? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I must tell you, Sujata, we were talking before we came on, we were talking about William Dalrymple, the author who writes these wonderful books on Indian history. And he and I had a microphone mishap together some years ago. We were in the green room before an event. There were about 300 or 400 people in the hall, and we had the mics on, but we didn't know that they were on. And we were talking, and Willie Dalrymple said to me, "How old are your authors?" So your readers. And I said, "Well, I've got some fairly young readers and not so young readers." And he said, "Mine are positively ancient." And this is the point at which we saw the organizers running down the corridor towards us, and we'd been transmitting into the hall. So I said, "Willie," he was terribly embarrassed about this, and I said, "Willie, look, don't worry. If your readers are as old as you say they are, they won't have heard what you said." Yeah. But we shouldn't joke about microphones when we're using them, because Nemesis has got her radar on, right. And she'll get
and
us.
We are in Washington.
And
anything could happen with what we say in Washington. So, well, you know what Diana was saying, that now we almost hardly know how to address you. Sir Alexander McCall Smith, you were knighted in King Charles New Year's Day honors just this year. Now, not a lot of, I don't know if there's a soul in the room who's been to when a knight is installed or however it happens. Could you tell us a little bit what that experience was like for you?
Yes, certainly. It's, I mean, it doesn't, you don't feel any different after you've been through it. You get a letter, and the letter says that the government takes the view that it should recommend to the king that you should get this, and then it says don't speak about it. And this is about 2 or 3 months, 2 months before they announce it. So they tell you, under no circumstances are you to say anything about it? And I observed that, and I didn't tell my daughters. My wife saw the letter, and my assistant saw the letter, but actually we took it pretty seriously. And then you get all dressed up, and you go along, and it's a very nice ceremony. You're briefed in advance, and then you walk into this room, and you stand there with somebody in uniform. Don't know exactly what his role is, but nonetheless, he tries to talk to you to get you to calm down, and so he was talking to me, and I'm afraid I really wasn't listening to him. And then you walk forward, and there's a stool with a support, because people who get this sort of thing may be a little bit advanced in age, and they've probably got a sort of machine that can push you in extreme cases. And you kneel down, and then somebody gives him a sword, and you get a tap on the shoulder. And the thing which struck me was that the sword was very heavy, and so you get a decent a knock on the shoulder. You know, you feel it, and and I felt it, and then you stand up, and that's it. And I said to the Queen afterwards, a bit afterwards, I said I really felt we got quite a proper dunt, as they put it in Glasgow, on the shoulder. And she said, I hope that you're not bruised by the occasion, which I wasn't. And that was it. And then you go home, and that's it. So it doesn't make any difference.
Well, you did dress a little bit more specially for that event than this one. I saw pictures of what you were wearing. Do you want to tell the audience about your clan?
Well, Sujata, I almost put on my kilt for this occasion. I really did. It's in the hotel in a suitcase, but I'd been wearing it on the last 3 occasions on this tour, and I thought, oh gosh, I'll just have a bit of a change, and I'm so sorry. I don't know if I've got time to go back to the hotel to get it.
It's beautiful.
It is a nice kilt, yes.
Yeah.
It's McPherson tartan, and that's a nice grey tartan. And the kilt actually is really quite a comfortable garment. It's very heavy. The wool is very heavy, and it keeps its pleats. I don't know how many yards of material go into it, but it's quite a construction. The thing about kilts, though, is that I find that kilts shrink.
Well, they are wool.
Well, yes, I suspect that kilts remain the same, and I think that. But people do complain about that, and they'll say things. I just can't get into my kilt. My kilt is. And at the beginning of this tour, I got the kilt out. I was doing an event up in New Hampshire, and I said I'd put the kilt on. I put the kilt on, and I had difficulty with the straps. You've got 2 leather straps, and so I had to really take a very deep breath, and eventually I got on. Then I couldn't get out of it.
Yeah. Oh.
And I thought that was an extremely embarrassing situation. If I had to go down to the lobby of the hotel and say to them, would you mind terribly if you removed? And that's the point which they'd call the police or whatever it would be. There'd be a misunderstanding. So it is a nice garment. It's a very comfortable garment, and I find it quite useful when I'm doing an event and I'm wearing my kilt, because sometimes people say in the questions, how do you write in the voice of a woman, which I tend to do in these books, and I say, well, you may notice I'm wearing a skirt, and that evades the question altogether.
Yeah. Well, it's like a lifetime. I mean, these books, they're from the 1990s, right, onward, for the adult fiction that you've written. Before that, there were 10 years of children's books. But originally, you trained as a lawyer. You taught law in Africa and in Edinburgh. And what was it like? I mean, did you actually enter law because your father was involved in law, or why did you make that choice?
No, I think I was very interested in it. I was always interested in it, and I don't regret having had a legal training, having trained as a lawyer. Eventually, I ended up being an academic lawyer. I was a law professor, and I ended up as professor of medical law at the University of Edinburgh for many years. That's what I did. And that was a very interesting branch of the law. So I was interested in medical law. I was interested also in criminal law, because criminal law involves many very interesting issues of responsibility and human action. You can approach the criminal law as a philosopher, really. It can be a branch of philosophy in terms of philosophy of responsibility and philosophy of action, and also there are all sorts of issues of social policy associated with the application of the criminal law. But then I got very involved in medical law, which looks at all sorts of fascinating issues of the relationship between medicine and science and the law. So I did that for a long time, and that took me into bioethics. And I was on a number of bodies, bioethics bodies. I was on the UNESCO International Bioethics Commission, which I found quite interesting, which was looking at genetic information and matters of that sort. So it was quite an interesting career. But in my spare time, I was writing. And of course, writers often, in fact, in most cases, have to have an honest job as well. And so that was my day job, writing. And then I wrote the Number One Ladies Detective Agency, was my first successful book. And that enabled me to make a decision as to whether I was going to be a full-time writer.
Yeah.
And so I had a career change, which I think is quite an interesting thing to do.
I want to stop at that point because you and I, we both sort of entered this field of mystery writing in the 1990s. And I remember as I was writing, my first series is set in Japan, my second is set in India, and I remember sitting just like you in a situation like that, but there were a very important lady editor from New York was asked the question about mysteries with foreign settings. And she said, oh, they don't sell unless it's England or France. And then she paused. She said, Italy. And that was it. And so here I was writing about Asia, and I thought it would never work. So did you ever get any kind of blowback from agents that people wouldn't want to read a novel set in Botswana?
That's really interesting, because I think what happened with me, I hadn't set out to write in the genre of crime fiction, and I think both you and I are at this sort of cozy end of it, and we're not really dealing with the nitty-gritty in the way in which many crime writers are, and I write about things which aren't crime at all as well. So I've never really felt that I'm a credible crime writer. But when I started, yes, I had difficulty getting the Number One Ladies Detective Agency published. Every author, I think, has difficulty getting the first novel published anyway. It's a sort of mountain ahead of people, whatever the merits of the book. But particularly, I had exactly that difficulty. It wasn't so much location, but it was perhaps mood or register, in that my books were, the Number One Ladies Detective Agency is quite a gentle book. And in my particular case, there was an issue about Scottish writers, and Scottish writers are meant to be sort of fairly confrontational or tough and gritty.
Oh, yeah. Look at Ian Rankin, for example.
Well, Ian's a great friend of mine, and Ian was my neighbour until comparatively recently. He lived a few doors away from me, and Ian's. I mean, there are people who are grittier than Ian. Ian's relatively ungritty. But yeah, I mean, Ian's we're writing about the same city with my Scotland Street books. Mm-hmm. Ian's writing about a rather different Edinburgh.
Well, so you were saying that the feeling was that they thought the vibe was not right because it was cozy.
Well, I think it was that. There may also have been something that you alluded to there about the setting, and I think that publishers can be tremendously conservative. They know what works. And of course, many publishers spend a lot of their time chasing what's just worked and trying to repeat the success. Now, what has just worked may be something slightly different, and so they then all want to emulate that in what they do next. I think that there are fashions in settings, in that I think that there was a very considerable fashion in favor of Scandinavian
Yes.
crime. And that apparently has abated, and apparently that doesn't enjoy the support and interest that it did. But, I mean, that's why I set out. I did a Scandinavian series. I read my Ulf Varg books.
Oh, yeah.
Because I felt, why should Scandinavian writers have all the fun when those of us who aren't Scandinavian could write a...
Yeah.
So I did a series of three novels about Ulf Varg, who's a Swedish detective.
Yeah. I have one of those on my bedside table. I was trying to prepare for this, and so I went to the library, and I originally thought you had like 4 series, but it's more like 10, or, it's a really...
I suffer, Sujata, I suffer from a condition called serial novelism.
Yeah.
And there's no known cure.
To that.
You write serial novels and then you die,
Yeah.
that's it.
Well, getting back to your very first series, the #1 Lady Detective Agency, why did you choose to write about Botswana and write through a female voice?
Well, 2 aspects of that. The first, the choice of Botswana. I had a long connection with what used to be the joint university of Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland, which were the 3 small countries in southern Africa there. And I had looked after students from these countries when they came to Scotland. That was part of my job. And so I had that association. And then I came up for a sabbatical from the University of Edinburgh, by whom I was employed. And I went and spent that teaching in Swaziland, the university there. And when I was in Swaziland, I went over to Botswana to visit the university there that I had this connection with. And so I began to become more interested in Botswana. Then the following year, I was invited to go and start a law school in Botswana, which I did. That was just shortly before I got married, so I had the time and could go off and do this. And so I went and lived in Botswana in 1981. And I was just immediately impressed with the country. It's an exceptional country in so many respects. It's a very fine country, and I found myself admiring the people and liking the place. It's a good country. There's a real palpable feeling of good about it. And I was just intrigued by it. And over the years, I went back every year. I had various projects. I was an external examiner of the university. I was writing a book on the criminal law of Botswana with a colleague there and so on. So I just continued to have this close association.
Yeah.
And then I thought I'd write about a person who lived in Botswana so I could say something about the country. Why did I choose a woman protagonist? Quite a lot of my books, the women characters are the main character. My Isabel Dalhousie series, that's another example of that. And so that, to me, I suppose the reason why I did that was that I wanted to write about a particular sort of Botswana lady I'd seen, intuitive, very intelligent, hardworking, and with a considerable generosity of spirit. And so I wanted to write about somebody like that. And also, I found that it would be, I find the conversation of women can be very different from the conversation of men. I know these are sort of broad statements and it involves resorting to all sorts of stereotypes. But the thing about stereotypes is that they're often correct. That's why they're stereotypes. And I think that the conversation of women is often, women are more prepared to be subjective and to talk about their feelings a bit more. Men, that's changing with male conversation. I think men are less inhibited. Men, I think, have benefited from women's liberation in that men have realized they can now talk about their emotions in a way in which they really weren't able to do in the past. Men were expected to be strong and silent and to put up with internal suffering, for example. Women's conversation is more attuned to the examination of subjective feelings, emotions, and I think that if I'd written 2 male detectives sitting in that little office in Gaborone, it would have been a totally different sort of conversation.
Oh, yeah. And I feel like this book especially, there seems to be almost a meditation about the differences between men and women and also how we need each other and can support each other. There's a really wonderful scene. I'm not going to give any spoilers. I'm trying really hard not to give any spoilers, but when Ma Ramatswe sorts out a situation with a marriage that is sort of like having a little bit of trouble and somebody's a little bit unkind to the other person and the other person's acting out a little strangely and she just kind of pulls it together.
Yeah.
And then we see Ma Makutsi doing something with brothers and 2 brothers and a cousin. And
Yes.
it's just, I really enjoyed that so much.
Well, I think that they are, Mara Matsui and Mama Kutsi are in their different ways psychologists, and they understand human nature. Mara Matsui, in my mind, is a character composed entirely of good. I mean, she's a really, really good person, without being sort of a Pollyanna, but and always optimistic about things. But she's actually the sort of person that you'd like to sit down and have a cup of tea with. She's understanding. She's kind. I think it's kindness is what those books are about. I find kindness I find it really, really interesting. I love witnessing an act of kindness. I mean, the quickest way to reduce me to tears is to see something like that. I tear up pretty quickly when I...
Stay away from the internet and the pictures of little cats and dogs. And, I saw a picture of a mother owl with little owlets popped up on my feed the other day. And it just,
Yes.
yeah, that kind of thing. Like, to see animals being kind. Don't you love that? That's even more extreme.
Yes, I haven't really gone there very much, but I will take your recommendation.
Yeah.
And I like watching singing cats on the internet. I think, if we're all honest, who amongst us doesn't enjoy that?
Yeah. Well, that brings me to the topic of technology, because it seems like you're trying to keep technology out of all your series.
Yes.
And tell me about that decision. Tell us all about it.
Well, I'm not a technophobe. I love gadgets and gizmos, but I don't like putting them in the books, because I think that if you look at what the implications of Google are for crime fiction, it takes away all the detection. There's absolutely no research necessarily done. You just say, Siri, who did this? And Siri gives the answer. But Google actually requires, it's reduced research. It's a very interesting question. I think that there are respects in which technology can destroy the joy of human investigation, or indeed of of limitations to human knowledge. Proust, here I go quoting Proust. I like quoting Proust. If you quote Proust to people, if you're talking to somebody you want to shut up, you just say, well, of course, as Proust says. And then they immediately become embarrassed. Oh, and if you really want to rub it in, you say, as you well know, as Proust says. And then they really... But Proust said that steamships insult the dignity of distance, which is an interesting thing for Proust or anybody to say, because it means that the modern world has shrunk so much. I don't know what Proust would have said about aeroplanes, passenger aeroplanes, even a fortiori, they insult the dignity of distance. So technology actually can ruin things. And also, I mean, modern medicine, antibiotics could ruin opera. For example, Mimi in La Boheme, poor Mimi is dying. She takes quite some time to die. These days, you just say penicillin, Mimi, and that's it, and you don't even get your Act 3. So antibiotics are bad news for opera, and in the number one latest detective agency, we don't have cell phones, as you've noticed, and if you go to Botswana, everybody's chatting away on their cell phone, but not in my books. They don't have computers in the office. I don't mention typewriters anymore. I did at the beginning. They had typewriters. I think now I've stopped mentioning typewriters. I'd like them to have a typewriter, but I don't mention it. So, but we don't have cell phones. In my Scottish books, we didn't have email for a long time. We're getting a bit of email now. Isabel Dalhousie she still gets letters. Yeah. She still gets letters. So I think modern technology is a bit sterile, and but I also don't observe strict chronology. I have a very vague chronology. In the Scotland Street books, young Bertie, one of my favourite characters, he was 6 for 8 years, and he's now 7, and people say to me, is Bertie ever going to grow up? Is he ever going to be 18? Which is what he dearly wants to be, because he wants to leave his mother, who's very pushy, and he's read that when you're 18, you can leave your mother and go and live in Glasgow, which is what he'd like to do. So I think people quite like the calm that goes with the absence of technology.
Yeah, I agree. I get a especially warm feeling in those Scotland books where it's just it's so super cozy. And how did this? I recently learned that the 44 Scotland Street series, that it appears in serial installments in the Scotsman newspaper. And so how did that come about, and what is that process, the working process, like when you have your story coming out?
Well, it started actually, 44 Scotland Street had a rather odd beginning, and I was on tour in the United States, and Amy Tan, the novelist, had been very kind to me, and she said, when you come to San Francisco, we'll have a party. And I pitched up in San Francisco, and Amy had a party. I went along to her house, and there were all these various literary types from the area, and including Armistead Maupin, who wrote, of course, Tales of the City, which was published in the San Francisco Chronicle. And Armistead actually really was the person who revived the newspaper serial novel, which in the past everybody used to...
I read that, and I think that was the year I was living in Berkeley, that I read that. I loved the Tales from the City.
Yes, I thought they were they were very good. People like that feel of the... It's almost, to use the term soap opera is a little bit pejorative, which I don't intend it to be, but the comfort of a local story. It's the story that you hear round the parish pump. And it's very, and I think he did it very well. Anyway, at this party, I had a conversation with him, and he said to me, one thing you mustn't do is write a serial novel in a newspaper. So I went back to Scotland, and I was asked by one of the newspapers to write an article about my tour, and I wrote that, and I said I'd had this conversation with Armistead, and then I said, what a pity that newspapers don't have serial novels anymore. And I received a telephone call from the editor of the Scotsman newspaper who said, come to lunch. And so I went to lunch, and he said, you're on, write us a serial novel. And I said, oh, it'll be a bit difficult doing a chapter a week. And he said, we don't mean a chapter a week, we mean a day.
Yeah.
And that's the point at which machismo kicked in. I said, no problem.
Even though, how many other books were under contract at that time?
Well, I was writing quite a few books, but I just, you get an idea. And so I agreed to do it. And then I thought, oh, my goodness, I've got no idea what this thing's going to be about. I had come up with a title. 44 Scotland Street seemed to me to be a good title. Scotland Street's a rather nice street in the Edinburgh Georgian Newtown. It doesn't go up to 44, but I created that. And then I started to write it. And it worked. And I suddenly found myself in this continuing universe of these characters in Scotland Street. And I'm now working on volume 18, so it's been going for many years. And it appears in the newspaper. The next one will start in February. And it runs for about 3 months, 2.5, 3 months in the newspaper, then comes out as a book. So, and touching all available wood, I haven't missed, I shouldn't say this. I talked about Nemesis and her radar she's picking up at the moment. I didn't miss an episode. There was one where I almost missed, and it wasn't my fault. We were on the QM2 Cunard's boat. They'd asked me to go and give some talks on the boat going around South America, and we rounded the Horn, and I was sending the chapters back to the Scotsman in Edinburgh by email, and suddenly the email on the ship disappeared, and we had a couple of days with no email, and they were worrying in Edinburgh because I was about to miss a deadline. And then we sailed up this big fjord in Chile, and as we approached the glacier, suddenly the email sprung to life, and so I was able to send. We were going. It was Pius IX glacier. Now I would have thought it's an odd compliment to pay a pope to call a glacier after him.
Yeah. Oh, gosh.
I'd prefer some other geological feature.
Yeah. So you're just literally producing these. They're going in. What if you change your mind? Like when I'm writing a book, I change my mind all the time. I might make a bad person an okay person, and I might have someone else do this other thing. How do you deal with those feelings of wanting to change your story?
You can't. Recently, I've taken to writing the whole thing before it goes into the paper, and I've done that for the last 3 of the 18 volumes or whatever. And but before that, I couldn't, and so there were changes. You were committed. You couldn't then change, and so it also led to potential inconsistencies. What you could do if you had a character that you had done something to, has disappeared, for example, but you wanted, or if you just forget to put a character in, you just say, you just ignore it. And because that's what happens in life.
Yeah.
People disappear. It's the same happens with the writers of television soap operas. There's a very popular Australian soap opera called Neighbours, which is vastly popular. And there, what happens is that if the characters go out, they say they've gone to Brisbane. And so if some, for example, if one of the actors dies or is sick or something like that, where's so-and-so? I don't know, gone to Brisbane. Or they're washed out to sea. That's another, one of the characters is washed out to sea, And all that they found was his glasses on a rock.
Yeah.
And he was out of the series for 6 months, probably contractual problems.
Yeah.
And then they brought him back. And of course, when they bring them back, they've usually lost their memory, because loss of memory is a very common condition in soapland.
Yeah.
It's much more common than the common cold.
What about the real people that you feature by name? For example, isn't the art dealer? Is he your art dealer?
Yes, Guy Peplow. Guy, he plays a part in 2 series. I bring him in. My friend Charlie McLean, who's the world authority on Scotch whisky, writes books on Scotch whisky. He appears in the books, and I get people asking. Usually, I don't do it for, they ask, will you do it for charity? We'll have an auction for and I tend not to do that. I do it, I suppose, out of friendship for the individual characters. There was one occasion in which I was at a do, and I met the then First Minister, who's the Scottish equivalent of the Prime Minister, the First Minister of Scotland. And he said he was reading the Scotland Street series. And I said, well, First Minister, would you like to be in it? Mm-hmm. And he said, oh, yes, okay. And then I couldn't work out what he could do. And so I had wee Bertie crossing the street, and the bus is coming down the hill at great speed towards Bertie, and Bertie freezes. And it just so happens the First Minister of Scotland's walking up the sidewalk along the road, and he very bravely rushes out and rescues Bertie. And so I wrote this, and we sent it to the First Minister's press secretary and said, will you just run this past the First Minister? And within 45 minutes, back came the response, very satisfactory.
Yeah, see, the thing is, you have to flatter them. If it's a real
like it.
person, you have to.
If you're a real person, and if you write anything which isn't flattering, then the real person will get in touch with you. Mm-hmm. I once wrote. I did it I hope in a gentle spirit, but I wrote an incident in the earlier Scotland Street books about how somebody goes to the annual dance of the South Edinburgh Conservative Association. Mm-hmm. And I say that they only had 6 people there.
Oh.
And so they therefore couldn't do an eightsome reel, which is a Scottish country dance, requires 8 people. A couple of weeks later, I was at some function and my shoulder was tapped. And this woman looked at me and she said, I am the secretary of the Edinburgh South Conservative Association. And we always get many more than 6 people at our...
Yeah, so aside from those funny grown-ups, the children in your books have been so wonderful. Bertie is especially close to my heart. Is
Bertie.
he your favorite character?
He's
in the
one of my
series?
absolute favorite characters. Bertie is such a wonderful little boy. He's now 7, as I say, having been 6 for a long time. His problem is his mother, and that's often the case with little boys. If you say to them, what's your problem in this life? They'll be a little bit reticent, but then they might eventually say, well, actually, Mummy is an issue. And we've got a serious problem in Edinburgh, where I live, with excessively pushy mothers. We've got the highest instance of pushy mothers of anywhere in the UK. And the Scottish Government is aware of the issue, but hasn't done anything about it. And Bertie's mother, when he's 6 at the beginning of the books, he has to learn the saxophone. He has to learn Italian, so he can appreciate Italian culture. Has Italian conversazione classes with his mother. He has psychotherapy, and he has yoga, and all of these. And all he wants to be is a little boy doing ordinary boy things. So, and in particular, he wants a Swiss Army penknife, which he's never going to get from his mother. When he has his 7th birthday, eventually, I have Irene give him a couple of presents all nicely wrapped up. He sees his parcel, and Bertie thinks, oh, maybe this is a Swiss Army penknife. Opens it, no, it's a gender-neutral play figure. And opens the other package, What's in that? Is this a Swiss Army penknife? No, it's a junior UN peacekeeping kit.
Yeah.
And he just, I do actually take him, I give him glimpses of freedom. He goes off fishing with his father, and they go fishing the Pendant Hills just outside Edinburgh, and they get lost, a mist descends. They go to this farmhouse, and the farmer's wife says, come in, I'll get my husband to go and find your car. And Bertie realizes in this house is a real 6-year-old boy leading the life of a real 6-year-old boy. And he's called Andy. And he says to Bertie, Bertie, would you like to see my things? And Bertie says, oh, yes, please. Takes him upstairs. Andy takes Bertie up to his room and opens a drawer. And there in the drawer is not one, but 6 Swiss Army penknives.
Oh, gosh.
And Bertie's little heart fills with joy. Andy reaches for one of these penknives and says, this, Bertie, is a Swiss Army penknife. The Swiss Army fights only with penknives. And Bertie says, I've heard that. I feel so sorry for him. He's such a nice little boy. I'm not going to let him grow up in the books because I don't want to lose the ability to write about this really desperate world of children. You know, it's a real jungle down there.
Yeah, I think we'd be so disappointed
Yeah.
if you did age him. Are your series all kept open indefinitely, or have you ever decided that one series has had enough books?
No, I keep it going. I haven't done many of the Corduroy Mansions series, and people often say to me, are we going to get more Corduroy Mansions? I did three or four of those, and I then stopped. I think other things happened. I quite liked the characters in that, and in particular, I liked, there was a dog in that. I often put dogs into my books, and there was a very fine dog in that called Freddy de la Haye, had a very posh name. And he had a bad background because he had been a sniffer dog at the airport, London airport, sniffing out the drugs. You know, they have these detector dogs. And Freddy was quite a successful sniffer dog, but then he was a victim of political correctness because they found all the dogs were male. Yeah. And this was unfair to the female dogs. So they fired half the male dogs and put in the female dogs. Bad move, because thereafter the male dogs were only interested in the female dogs.
Oh, dear.
And the drugs flooded into the country,
Oh,
unrestrained.
It's too much. It's too much to believe. So I want to get. I would be amiss not to ask you about your writing life, and I'm going to start off with something that I read. That if just like there are a few people here, probably like me, that might wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning, and they struggle to get back to sleep. What do you do?
Well, I do often wake up in the small hours, which can be rather melancholy hours.
Yeah.
There's, you know, the Irish have a lovely term for that. They say the hour of the wolf for 3 o'clock in the morning, 3:30 in the morning, and I find that quite evocative. I think you may feel that it's a bit lupine that hour because your body sugars are low or whatever, but I will get up and write. And I find that quite a good time. I go back to bed after a couple of hours, but I would do a couple of hours of writing then. I find I write in the morning. I don't know where. Do you have particular hours where you...
Yeah, I usually, I try to write in the morning, but if life gets in the way, I would write in the afternoon. But after when I was doing my research on you,
Right.
when I woke up at 3 o'clock a few days ago, I got up and I worked. And it actually was not bad. So I highly recommend.
There you are.
Like
there
you
you
could
are.
have this the writing school for ladies and men. You know, the Kalahari writing school for all of us. Yeah. But I'm curious about like what it's like, how quickly you get in flow, and whether you work on more than one book at a time.
Yes, I sometimes do work on more than one book at a time because I write about 5 books a year, and therefore I have to have an allocated time for. So I have particular seasons for writing particular series. I suppose, looking at the actual way that I do it, I'm very, very conscious of my good fortune in that I do write quickly. And I think I'm very, very conscious of how fortunate I am in being able to do that. So I write usually 1,000 words an hour is the rate at which sorry, I don't say this in a boastful way, but that's just the way it works.
That's about 4 pages if you're
So-
a double-spaced person.
So I sit there and I go into what the psychiatrists would probably call a minor dissociative state. So I'm aware of my surroundings, but I go into a sort of, I wouldn't want to use the word trance. I think dissociative state is a better term to use. Well, it doesn't sound quite as creepy as a trance, but I'm aware of my surroundings, but time moves at a different pace. It's quite extraordinary. Subjective time speeds up, and an hour will seem to me like 5 minutes. I mean, it really is. It's the only circumstances which I find that time accelerates to that extent. And so 5 minutes later, an hour has passed, and I actually haven't had to think about what is happening. So it's a question of being in touch with the subconscious mind, I think, which is the source of speech. I mean, this conversation that we're having at the moment, we aren't necessarily thinking, I must say this next, or this is the next word that I will use. Human speech proceeds without that sort of conscious cogitative process. And that's what happens when I'm writing. I don't really have to think what's going to happen, and it just comes out.
I'm sorry. Was it always like that, or did you sort of develop it like a muscle?
I think that's a very interesting question, Sujata. There, I think I developed it. It wasn't always like that. I think that writing is like any pursuit, such as playing the piano. I think that if you look at the way in which people who can play the piano, they don't say to themselves, I'm going to put my thumb on middle C and then this finger on G below it or whatever. It goes automatically. So you develop brain pathways, I think. And that's something that practice can do, just as practicing your scales when you're playing the piano develops that facility and pressing the keys in chord formation.
Yeah, I think that's a hopeful sign for everybody who wants to write. Do you have advice for people who are starting out or who haven't yet written a book, or who have a book they're privately working on?
Yes, I mean, I would say I've always done. I'm sure you are as well. When you're approached by people for advice, we like to encourage people. I always encourage people to write. I mean, so many people feel they've got a book inside them. They could have an X-ray, and with modern imaging techniques, you could probably tell whether it's a biography or crime or whatever. But I think that what I say to people is write from the heart, write what you want to write, and I think that always shows. If you're writing something because you believe that is what is expected or what is going to work, I think there can be a problem with that. People who write romantic novels, there's a firm in the UK that produces these, any number of them, probably a similar firm in the US, these romantic novels which are sold in supermarkets and whatnot. They have a sheet which they give out to people who say they want to write a novel for them. And right at the top of the sheet it says, if you don't believe in this, we can tell. You've got to believe. So you can't get some sort of smart Alex saying, "Oh, I'm going to write one of these things," because it will show. You know, it will just show. The heroine will say the wrong thing when she's looking into the eyes of the hero, and people will tell this is somebody who doesn't believe in romance. So you have to believe in it. And then the other thing which I always say is when you've written your first book, don't spend time on it, Because an awful lot of people, I don't know if you've discovered that with people you've advised, but they write the first book and then they spend years sometimes working. They say, well, I'm going to do a new draft. That's just not what you do. You really have to go to the second book, because the second book is going to be better. And of course, in view of what we were saying about writing being a matter of exercise, you can see why that would be the case.
Yeah.
So those are the, and of course, do you get lots of people pressing books into your hands, their manuscripts into your hands? Yes. What do you do?
So then
what's your response?
Okay, so people, sometimes they're friends, sometimes they're acquaintances.
Yep.
Yeah, they would like, for example, we would call it a blurb for the book. Is that what you mean?
Well, there's the case where the book is going to be published, and then the publisher says, could you do a blurb?
Yeah.
Or the friend who's written the book has got a publisher. There, if it's a friend has written a book and has got a publisher, you're caught. You have to.
Well, it sounds very civilized that it's going through publishers for you, but for a lot of writers at conventions, people will come up and they'll literally stick a book in your hand.
Yes.
And you can't take it away. But I mean, I try to make it a practice to write them for people who are having their first book published.
Yes.
Because that's when it means the most.
I quite agree. I mean, there are cases where you are, the duties of friendship require you to do a blurb. And there will be cases where you read the book and you think this is a wonderful book, and your blurb then is something that you really believe in. I must tell you, I had the strangest experience once. I was on tour and I was in, I think, South Carolina, and there was this chap in the audience who was quite a big event in a bookstore. There were a couple of hundred people there, big bookstore, and he was looking at me very intently like this while I was talking, and I had a keeper with me, and I almost said carer, and I whispered to this person, I'm a little bit concerned by somebody in the audience, and they looked and say, okay, yeah, we'll watch him. And in the signing line, this chap was in the signing line, approaching the table, still looking at me like this in a very intent fashion. And I was getting progressively more worried, and he came up to the table, and then he leant across the table and said, what are you doing afterwards?
Oh.
And they said, oh, he's leaving town, he's on his way to the airport. And then he reached for a bag, and I thought, this is going to be an incident. And he got the bag up and he put it on the table, and he said, I want you to read my book. And that's all he wanted. He wanted me to read his book.
Yeah.
And he'd had it privately printed. And I was mightily relieved that was the agenda. So I said, fine. He didn't even want my comments on it. He just wanted me to read it. So I took it back to the hotel, and I started to read. It was 550 pages, and it was all about a man who had been kidnapped by a shipload of nuns.
Oh, well, that actually sounds kind of delightful.
Have you read that one?
No, but it sounds really amusing,
Yes.
actually. Maybe that's why, because you're funny, he thought.
Well, this wasn't a funny book.
Oh,
this,
it wasn't.
This was a different sort of book, if
Okay.
you see what I mean.
If you can see what I mean. I've heard.
The nuns were, put it politely, they were enthusiasts.
Oh.
550 pages.
Oh, my God.
It's the sort of book, you see, you can imagine that when you've got that book, you can't take it with you on the airplane. I mean, you can't. Yeah. And so what do you do with it? So I forget where I did have to throw it away, but you could just imagine that you would sneakily leave it, and then as you're leaving the hotel, they'd run after you. Oh, excuse me, you've left it.
Yeah.
So you'd then arrive at the airport, and you'd go to the sort of trash can and try to put it, but the trash can would be full, and so then then you'd get to security, and they'd open and they'd say, "Is this your book?" You could do a whole short story.
Yeah.
It could be a whole short story.
It's so different from the kind of work you do. And I feel that you have really carved out this niche for mysteries that are, that they're joyful mysteries, and they're mysteries about small things happening. And I just think it's quite remarkable that I feel like I need this. I need this in my life.
Well, it's very kind of you, Sujata. Thanks so much. I mean, I think I like books about small things. Jane Austen famously talked about the little square of ivory, that her novels were a little painting on a tiny square of ivory, which they are. Look at Jane Austen. What does Jane Austen write about? What's the issue? It's whether so-and-so will marry so-and-so, which she usually does at the end of the book. Of course, they're witty. Barbara Pym's another one. I'm a great fan of Barbara Pym. Barbara Pym's, I think, the Jane Austen de nos jours. She's really very good. I really like the small, particular things, little arguments about minor things, because from those you can extrapolate about the whole human condition. So I had in my Scotland Street books, I had a long-running row about a blue-spode teacup that somebody said that they'd borrowed it and then didn't return it, so they broke into the flat to get it back and got the wrong cup. This is all so petty, but it's great fun, and that's really what a lot of human life is about. Very small things, and you can in fact reduce the major issues of our time. Stand for these small conflicts. I mean, they're writ large. They're the same antagonisms, competitiveness, suspicion, etc., just writ large on the international stage.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. So we're sadly drawing to a close of our conversation, though the signing is ahead, but I wondered if you might read something for us tonight.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. I never really like to read from the novels because I think that people come to a book launch or a book event and I don't think one wants to hear the author going on and on. I actually was at a book launch once in Edinburgh where the author read for 45 minutes from his book, and there were no seats. We were all standing, and it was reminiscent of the performances of the late Emperor Nero. Because with Nero's performances, they closed the gates of the amphitheatre. The only way in which you could get out was by dying, and or pretending to die, but you could only do that once. So we were really stuck. So I think brevity is really important. So I'm going to be very brief and just read from one of my collections of poetry. I've had 2 collections of poetry published. I write quite a lot of poetry. I like working with composers as a librettist, and this one is published. This was published in the States. This is the UK edition I've got, but it's in a time of distance. And if I could just quickly read one poem just to wrap up. This is a poem I wrote in an aeroplane, and I was on a plane. And I was reflecting. I was listening to the announcements coming over the PA system. Now they use a totally different language. They're speaking English, but it's not really English as we know it, because they use all sorts of circumlocutions and odd terms. So, for example, they say things like, they never say now, it's all at this time. At this time, we are commencing our descent. Now, really, who says that? You should really say, we're now going down, and or words to that effect. But there's this artificial language, and it's a very sterile language. And it suddenly occurred to me, what would happen if you had a pilot who was a poet, a pilot who used flowery language or expansive language, and did this over the public address system. So this is the poem about that. It's called The Language of Pilots. They speak with high authority, ailerons and wings responsive to their touch. Their words are functional too. But why, I wonder, should a pilot not be a poet too and say, we now descend at last through banks of cloud, white fields as wide as any ocean, at least when viewed from where we are, at least when viewed from this suspended a point. For it is Bernoulli's principle that lifts and keeps us here. This is all coming out over the PA system. Between the patient earth below and this empty, soaring sky, ladies and gentlemen, rain falls in distant vales. Look from your windows to the starboard side of this metal tube we call an aircraft. Look out there and see the rain, the grey-white shafts of rain. Do you know that those wisps of cloud you see up above are crystals of ice falling like gossamer? Did you know that? Now please, about your waists, affix the belts, you must. As slowly towards the earth we drop, to land's embrace, your belts adjust. We are a little late, but what are a few minutes, nothing more, here and there? Not much, I think. Goodbye, and take with you the things you brought, your few possessions. Goodbye, until we meet again, and once more we carry you on wings of steel, to places you would wish to go. Goodbye, dear friends. It matters not whether you're a member of the loyalty scheme we've got. We love you all, as parents love their children equally. Remember that, and please come back. Goodbye again, and cabin crew, unbar the doors, let light be seen, secure what needs securing, and cross-check whatever that might mean. Goodbye, goodbye. For soon these great engines on landing will be silenced, as will I.
So much for coming. Thank you very much, both of you. What a delightful evening.
What a journey.